One of the, still what I think is one of the funniest scenes in all of cinematic history comes from the masterpiece that came out in 1994 called Dumb and Dumber. Any of you see that movie, Dumb and Dumber? If you've never seen it, it focuses on two guys. One guy's named Harry, the other guy's named Lloyd Christmas. It's the best name ever, Lloyd Christmas. And a big part of the film focuses around a road trip. They have to get all the way out to Aspen, and of course they have no plan, and as you can tell from the title of the film, not the smartest guys around. And at one point in the film, everything is just falling apart, and the two main characters separate ways. One starts walking in one direction, the other guy walks another way. And eventually, a few scenes later, they end up meeting up again. And the one guy ends up selling the van, the thing that they had to get them to Aspen, sold it, and arrives driving a small little Vespa. And he shows up to the other guy, shows up to Lloyd, and he says, "Jump on." And the other guy says, I didn't think you could get any dumber than you already are. And then you completely redeem yourself. And I don't know why, but I find this the funniest scene ever of just all of a sudden you think that he's just going to yell at him again, but instead he jumps on and they carry on their crazy, weird adventure in that film. Well, today we're actually going to be focusing on that idea of redemption. What does redemption actually look like? And I think that this is the thing that this is a part of stories that we absolutely love. Whether it's a story of great adventure and heroics, of love and loss, whatever it is, often our stories end up having an aspect of redemption in that story, of someone experiencing deep change. And there's something about these stories, especially true stories, that draws us in. There's something about it that we always pause and look at to see how profound this actually is. And I think part of why we love redemption stories is because we can easily place ourselves in these stories. When we read about these stories, we often think, if that person can receive redemption, if they can change, then maybe I can too. If their story can change, then maybe my story can change. The idea of redemption is so incredibly important to us, and part of this is because it is close to the heart of God. Redemption is a central theme that runs all throughout Scripture, all throughout this book. This is a book of redemption and restoration. And today, we're going to be focusing on an incredibly important moment of redemption in especially one person's life. And we're going to see how this moment has far-reaching impact into numerous people's lives. And so today we're continuing on in our series, Sunday School Unfiltered. Next week I believe next week is our last week of this summer series. And all throughout this series, we're looking at well-known stories and passages of Scripture. Many of this, if you grew up in the church, many of these stories you probably have heard before. And we want to dig deeper into these passages. We want to see what are these passages really meant to teach us. This week, we are looking at the story of Rahab. So if you haven't already, turn your Bible to, or you open your Bible app to the book of Joshua, chapter 2. And I just want to mention, if ever you show up on a Sunday and you don't have a Bible, just let us know. We actually have Bibles out on our prayer desk out in our lobby. You can grab one of those, use that to follow along as we study the Word of God. So today, this passage, Joshua chapter 2, this is an incredibly important moment of restoration, of redemption. And to really understand what's happening in this passage, I want to give you a little bit of context. You need to understand that at this point in Israel's history, in many ways, they are homeless. Israel had a dramatic departure from the land of Egypt as they left slavery. And for 40 years, as part of their history, they would spend 40 years in the wilderness, waiting a day in which God would finally give them a place to call home. Everything else prior to that was not permanent. They were waiting, they were wandering, they were wondering what is going to happen next. They knew that God had promised a place for them. And so now in Joshua, we actually see the fulfillment of that process. Under Joshua's leadership, they are now entering what they understood to be the promised land, but there's a problem. The book of Joshua records the battles that would take place over this land. This land was not empty. In the time that Israel spent in slavery in Egypt, the few hundred years that they were there, the land that they would eventually possess was taken over by other people. And so Joshua records the battles that took place as they conquered the land, as they took over the promise that God had given to them. And so one particularly difficult area was the city of Jericho. And so this was a walled city, a city of great defenses, and they knew that this was going to cause problems as they walked into the land. And so Joshua sent over several spies to scout things out, to see how could they possibly take on this impossible task that God had placed in front of them. And so this is a story that's partially about the nation of Israel, partially about these two spies, but in many ways, this story will actually center around a woman named Rahab. And so I want to read this story. It's 14 verses in particular we're going to focus on. So starting off in verse 1, I'm going to read this whole passage here. And so Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 men as spies from the acacia grove, saying, "Go and scout the land, especially Jericho." So they left, and they came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelite men have come here tonight to investigate the land." And then the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab and said, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, for they come to investigate the entire land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, "Yes, the men did come to me, but I don't know where they were from. And at nightfall, when the city gate was about to close, the men went out, and I don't know where they are going. Chase after them quickly, and you will catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof. She had hidden them among the stalks of flax that she arranged on the roof. The men pursued them along the road to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as they left to pursue them, the city gate was shut. Before the men fell asleep, she went up to the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in this land is panicking because of you. For we have heard about how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did in Sihon and Og and the 2 Amorite kings you completely destroyed across the Jordan. And when we heard this, we lost heart, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now please swear to me by the Lord that you will also show kindness to my father's family because I showed kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, and sisters, and all who belong to them, and save us from death." And the men answered her, "We will give our lives for yours. If you don't report our mission, we will show kindness and faithfulness to you when the Lord gives us the land." We'll pause right there. This is an incredible story of redemption. There are 3 main things I want us to see in this story. The first thing we need to understand is this, is that no redemption story is too daunting for Jesus. When we think about redemption stories, we often think about how someone hits rock bottom and then they turn their lives around. Kind of like that story I started off with of this idea of redemption, how this guy, like he fixed things, he solved the problem. And often this has become like a Hollywood trope nowadays. You see in different movies, especially like rock star biopics. It seems to be something that's coming out each year now of different people who became really famous in the 60s, 70s or so. And part of how they tell the story is this person became famous because they're incredibly talented, but then they get jaded, they get addicted to drugs and alcohol, and they hit rock bottom, and then in some miraculous turn they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And this has become kind of a trope nowadays in film, that this is how you tell a story of someone's life. And yet a biblical view of redemption reveals how true redemption is too daunting of a task for us to take upon ourselves. The Word of God never says, hey, just fix this entirely on your own, just kind of white knuckle it and figure it out, and then God will love you. Instead, it's the reverse of that. That in so many cases, we can't pick ourselves up by our bootstraps. In so many cases, we actually need someone or something to come and rescue us. And this is what we see in this story. In Joshua chapter 2, this is a story of a people who cannot save themselves. There's several main characters. You have, first of all, you have the nation of Israel. They're in trouble because they're taking on nations far more powerful than themselves. Moses is gone. They have a new leader, Joshua. And how on earth will this small nation possibly go in and conquer and take the land that was promised to them? And then you have the two spies. They go nameless in this passage. These two spies, they're in trouble because, they've been sent into this land, and part of their trouble is they've been found out. In fact, it seems like they're absolutely terrible spies. They go in, they're supposed to scout it out, and the king, it just says, verse 2, the king knows where they're at. And they end up at a prostitute's house. Like, part of this, it never explains that. What's going on here? If you're a spy, you probably shouldn't be doing any of these things. And they've been found out by the Jericho, call them the Jericho police. And then you have Rahab, who's clearly in trouble. In many ways, you could describe her this way, that she is a vulnerable sex worker caught up in all of this. And reading the story at the very beginning, you wonder, how is any of this going to work out? And it's important to understand that this idea of rescue and redemption is far too big for these people. That built into this story is this idea that God was going to have to do something. They refer to it often, especially Rahab. She says, I've heard the story of the Lord. I've heard how he has shown up time and time again in your nation's history, and I'm trusting he's going to show up today as well. And so she has this faith in the God that she has never encountered up until this point. And as we look at our stories, we need to understand that our redemption is too big for us as well. We read the story, we're supposed to actually feel the weight of this situation, of how hopeless this is in so many ways. And we are meant to feel the weight of our situation as well as we read the Word of God. How incredibly important it is that we receive redemption, something outside of us. We see this in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. This is how the Apostle Paul describes it. He says, but God proves his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, as some translations put it as, while we were still his enemies, Christ died for us. How much more then, since we have now been justified by his blood, we will be saved through him from wrath. This is the gospel hope that we need to base our lives upon, is this redemption that only Christ can possibly offer to us. And we need to see in this gospel hope really how this is meant to impact our lives. It's meant to impact both not just our present, but our past, our present, and our future. The gospel hope is supposed to have a dramatic impact in our lives. So part of God's redemption plan is a forgiven past. And part of today, I want to really focus in on Rahab's part of the story. In so many ways, she is the central figure in this passage in Joshua 2. We need to see that redemption, God's redemption plan, is a forgiven past. And this is what Rahab experiences. For Rahab, there is this turning point starting off in verse 9, recognizing who God is, recognizing that in him she can have real hope of where she was supposed to go. And so as she places her trust in God, in the God of Israel, she begins to show kindness to these spies that had somehow found their way into her home. And in this process, she isn't held to her former identity. Something has occurred in this moment. You see the kindness that she shows to them and the kindness that they in turn show to her. Redemption and forgiveness are not always this straightforward path. This is what we need to see in this passage. It's not always a straightforward plan of how all this is going to work itself out. In many ways, this is a dramatically messy story. If you read this, in some ways, this is an offensive story of how all this is coming down. But what we can see in this passage is what God is doing in this person's life. We can tell that something has occurred in Rahab's life. And the reality is we don't always understand what God is doing in the people's lives around us, or even what he is fully doing in our lives today. But part of the hope that we should see in here is that true redemption has the power to remove our shame and our brokenness. It's amazing that she had this ability in this moment to be able to say to these men, as your nation moves in, I choose your God. I choose to join you in this endeavor because I realize that it's only Yahweh, it's only the God of Israel is the one true God. And in this moment, all that has happened in her past has been taken away. And so part of God's redemption story is changing our past, but it also includes a better future. Rahab seeks protection from this impending battle. And really, in many ways, this is an impending judgment upon this land. And so as she is seeking this protection, in verse 14, we see that a promise is made. And in verse 21, we see that this promise is fulfilled as the men say to her, we will protect you, and we need to know where you are when we come back. And so in verse 21, it is told that she is to wrap a scarlet cord around outside of her home, so that as Israel goes into the land, they'll be able to recognize where her house is. And so in this moment, her future is made secure. And it's interesting, this passage, this idea of this scarlet cord, and in many ways, this is a callback to the Passover scene that happened back in Egypt. I'm sure that these spies are thinking about this scene where we're back in Egypt as these plagues are happening. In the final plague, the Israelites were told to paint the doorposts of their house with the blood of a lamb, so that God would pass over those houses in this moment of judgment upon the nation of Egypt. And so they're trying to figure out how will we pass over the judgment, this battle, this impending battle that's going to be happening in the upcoming days or weeks. And so they use a similar imagery again. And so as the Israelites experience a Passover, they're saying to Rahab, hey, you are going to experience a personal Passover in this moment as well. She has a better future. And in fact, they say, gather your family, bring them all in. We're all going to be together here. Bring them all in so that you all can be safe, that you can all be redeemed. Their future is secure. And part of God's redemption plan is also to give a present purpose. God is able to use those, this is an amazing thing in the passage. God is able to use those who are, let's put it this way, who are misguided. Now, the spies probably shouldn't have ended up at Rahab's house. That probably wasn't in Joshua's game plan when he told him to go and scout out this land. I'll put it this way. I think that they were misguided in their journey. And yet God was still able to use them. And God was able to use those who are broken and those who have shame. You see how God used Rahab in this powerful way. You can say, no, I'm going to wait for someone who has a better track record, someone who has a better resume. Instead, he looked at Rahab and said, I will use you for my glorious purpose. And I'm going to draw you into my family. And so no redemption story is too daunting for God. No story is too daunting for Jesus. He is able to do so much in us and through us. And so as you look at your stories, you look at what has happened as you desire God to use you, we should have incredible hope as we read this story and see it seems like everyone can be welcomed into God's family and he is able to use anyone before him. And so today, this is part of what we're seeking after is how is God going to use us? How is he going to use your story? So we'll get there in a moment. The second thing I want us to see in this passage regarding redemption is that no redemption story is without the pain of change. Rahab's life is completely changed after this encounter with the Israelite spies. She wouldn't just go back to life as normal. Very shortly after the spies escaped, Israel ends up attacking the city of Jericho. And so if you're familiar with the story at all, you know that the way in which they were told to attack Jericho, this walled city, and in fact their walls are so immense that Rahab's house is actually built into the walls. And so it's protected. There's no way for Israel at this point in their history to actually siege and take this over. But instead, we read the miracle that happened, that God instructed Israel to march around the city once a day for 6 days. And then on the seventh day, they would march around the city again. And then on the final day, on that seventh day, they're to blow their horns and make a shout, and the miracle would happen that the walls of Jericho would fall down and they would be victorious in this battle. An amazing moment. You can see, the Israelites are walking around. They're wondering, how could this possibly work? But this amazing moment in their history of God actually providing for them. And if you jump ahead into chapter 6, verse 20, this is what we see as the end result of this passage. In verse 20, it says, so the troops shouted and the ram's horns sounded. And when they heard the blast of the ram's horn, the troops gave a great shout and the wall collapsed and the troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. This amazing moment. And part of this we should be wondering, but what about Rahab? What about the promise? All the walls fell down. And verse 22 gives us an answer. It says, Joshua said to the two men who scouted the land, they said, go to the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of there and all who are with her, just as you swore to her. Here's the amazing thing that happened here. As we read earlier about this wall, again, we know how miraculous this is that this wall would be destroyed and that Rahab's life would be spared. And what this passage doesn't say is how terrifying this moment must have been for Rahab. As the Israelites circled around the city for 7 days, did she wonder to herself, are they going to keep their promise? Are they going to remember? Is the cord out the window in just the right way? Can they see it? Do they know that I'm still here? Did they get home safely? She's had no report. She doesn't know what is going to happen next. And so we can kind of wonder what's going on, how is she imagining all this? But what we do know for sure is that her life would never be the same after this moment. As the walls fell down around her, the way the passage describes it, all the walls fell down, but her house remained. And in that moment, Rahab knew for sure that her life would never, ever be the same again. But in many ways, her entire life fell apart in that moment. All that she knew crumbled before her eyes. The city that she grew up in, all the connections that she had, everything was falling apart. And then again, in that moment, she might be wondering, is this going to turn out okay? Is the God that I've trusted, is he truly good enough? What's going to happen in my future? And so it was a change. In many ways, I'm sure it was a painful change for her. And this is what we experience. Sometimes redemption involves a painful change. Change on its own is difficult enough. Who here actually enjoys change? Most people, as studies show, most people don't enjoy change. Studies have shown that very few people are what we call when a change happens, very few people are early adopters who jump right upon that trend or are just okay with change happening. Most people, the vast majority, are either slow or resistant to accept change in their lives. And so I've heard this from several people, and it's still a funny story to me, that when they get married, usually this is the guy speaking, that when they get married, they get married, and now they're with their spouse, and this is where their life begins, and they realize that this is a big change, and this person doesn't go back to their apartment. Instead, you're just together, just 24/7, and all of a sudden you have this change, and I kind of want some privacy. And some guys kind of explain this, but it was kind of nice when they'll leave. I would kind of have life to myself. And they realize, okay, I have to be okay with this change, even though it's the thing that they were building their lives towards. Just so excited to finally get married, but realizing, hey, this experiences some differences, some changes in our lives. And the same is true in our redemption stories, that if you're a follower of Christ, this is going to lead to some changes, and in some ways it can be a painful change. In some ways it means leaving behind the life that we have lived. It means changing our worldview or our perspective. And so it requires both an internal change that we experience as we receive the gospel, and it should always lead to an external change in how we live our lives. And often it is in that moment that we tend to struggle. How do we actually live this out? We see in this story that no redemption story is without faith. Put it this way: no redemption story is without faith, and no faith is without works. Why did Rahab experience this redemption that we see in this passage? What was it merely that she found herself in the right place at the right time, or is there more to it than that? We actually see the answer in the New Testament. It's made clear that her redemption story is directly connected with the faith that she placed in God. Hebrews chapter 11, it's a passage that records the names of central figures in Israel's history and the faith that they had. And right there, as part of this story, we encounter Rahab yet again. And in verse 31, it says, by faith, Rahab, the prostitute, welcomed the spies in peace and did not perish with those who disobeyed. We see that the reason why her redemption happened is because of the faith that she was placing in God, trusting that he is who she understood him to be. And so we are called to have this faith as well, but also we're to see the connection between faith and our actions. True Christian faith is always followed by action, and this is what led James to write this. James chapter 2, starting off in verse 25. He's looking at a different perspective. And both of these go together, complementary to each other. James 2:25, it says this, in the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? For just as the body is without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And so what we see in this passage is the idea of being a disciple of Jesus involves both having faith and having works. That we're called that we must believe. Jesus calls us to place our full faith in him, that is through that faith we can have grace. But this faith, as James calls it to, is dead without action. How we live, put it this way, how we live serves as evidence of what we believe. Serves as evidence of that life change that Christ has already provided for us. It does nothing to redeem us, but is shown as evidence of what has already happened. And so every Christian must ask themselves this question: what is Jesus calling me to do? If you already have belief, if you already have faith and trust in him, the question that we have to follow up is, what is he calling me to do? How is he calling me to change my life? In some ways, this can be difficult. I want to say that that's okay. Broadly speaking, as we see in Matthew 22, we are called to love God and love others and serve the world. Matthew 22, this is how Jesus describes as he's speaking to the Pharisees. He describes what's the greatest command. He says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And this is the greatest and most important command. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so if we're looking for a starting point, this is what we need to see, is that we're first called to love God with all of our hearts. What does loving God look like in your life? We're to love those around us. This means loving those who are in your church family, those who are followers of Christ, and loving those who are outside of that community, those who have yet to experience the love of Christ. This is the outreach that we are called to. So we are all called to this, and then specifically, we are all given specific gifts and specific situations that we are meant to use for greater kingdom impact. Jesus describes this in Matthew 25 when he gives the example of the parable of the talents. He gives this example of this ruler who gives to several of his servants different amounts of money, and he tells them to go and invest it while he is away on a journey, and when he comes back, he wants to see what they have accomplished. And several of the servants go and they invest and they work hard. They want to follow what the Lord has told them to do. And then one has decided to hide and keep everything safe and secure. And at the end of that story, we see that this ruler comes back and he says, "Well done to those who have used what he had given them to increase." But then he gets after the one who decided to do nothing with what he had been given. And so what we need to take away from a passage like that is understanding that God is going to give you something. It might be financial. It might be a skill. It might be a situation that he is calling you to steward well. It might just be merely the school or the employment situation that you're in that you can be pointing others to Christ. We're all given something specific to make a real lasting kingdom impact. And what God is calling us to is, will we take hold of that? And sometimes the reality is that because we can feel broken and we can still feel shame, it might feel like, that's not me, that's someone else. Someone else can take this on. I'm just going to shrink back just a little bit. And doubtless, that is how Rahab would have felt. She had lived a hard and shame-filled life. And yet God received her and brought her into his family. From that day that the walls of Jericho fell down, she found new life. There's no way that she would go back to living her old way. And so we see this in Matthew chapter 1. We actually see the conclusion. What actually happens to Rahab? In Matthew chapter 1, we actually read the genealogy of Jesus. What is his family background? And right there in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we see Rahab's name appears again. That she was the great-great-grandmother of King David. And through David's line, we understand that eventually would come the Messiah who we know is Jesus. This is what happened in Rahab's life, how God would bless her and use her, not just to redeem herself and not just to redeem her family members that were around her, but actually to play a significant role in redemption history. And what's interesting is that in this passage of Matthew 1, that this is the one place where she is not referred to as a prostitute. All the other stories I shared in Hebrews and James, they always use this word. They always describe her this way. And as we read that, you kind of wonder, like, hey, but she's changed. She's a different person. Why are you bringing this up again? That just seems kind of unfair. Well, what we need to understand is that this is not being used as a way to slight her. Instead, it is actually pointing to how deep that change was in her life. Understand this, that God can make your mess a part of your message. He used her in a profound way. And we see this time and time again of how God is able to use stories like this. Or to put it this way, sometimes scars tell the story best. We can see how deep and how profound the forgiveness and redemption of Rahab is. She's forgiven through Christ. She is a new creation. And yet, her past serves as this powerful testimony. And I'm sure if we could hear her speak, as she spoke boldly with those spies, she would say, that's who I was, but my life is changed. And this is what Christ offers to us. Sometimes scars tell the story best. And so I find it remarkable that after his resurrection, Jesus still carried the marks of his crucifixion. In John 20, we see Thomas who doubted the resurrection of Christ, and he said that he needed to see these scars, he needed to see these marks in order to believe. And so when Christ appeared in front of him, he knew that this was true. He knew what truly had happened. And this didn't hold Jesus back. Instead, it showed who he is. And so this is the one in whom we place our hope and our trust in today. And so this morning, as part of this idea of receiving the redemption of Christ, that Christ offers, we're going to take up communion today. We practice this as a reminder of what Christ did for us on the cross. And so up in the front here, we have two different tables.